Anyhow, Brian, it's nice to see you again, hear you
It's
again.
very nice to see you. I hope, well, I was going to say, I hope you're well. I can see that you are.
Oh, thank you. Uh, yes, I had a query. You may have heard of of course, molecular biologists and their cell biologists. The molecular biologists even they have to concern themselves with editing and replicating and all types of activities that seem to require intelligent manipulation. It's actually amazing how what so-called chaperone molecules and other things suddenly appear just when they're needed in just the right place, and how that
Yes.
all happens is quite unknown. Indicating that something beyond the molecules is operating, especially Barbara McClintock. She studied that phenomenon and used to think of thoughtful, molecules, thoughtful DNA processes. I think Lynn Margulis also was very impressed by her work. And then that's one level of biologists. The other level is, of course, the cell biologists, and they operate on a very different level than the molecular biologists. But I'm wondering, have you ever heard of the organismic biologists? They,
Yes.
let me just say one other thing. They have their statement that cells don't create plants. Plants create the cells. That's the difference between the cellular and organismic biologists.
Yes, I think the organismic biologists, I've just got it the wrong way around. The cells are the plants. The cells create the plants. The mistake of the organismal train of thought is that they imagine, and this is very popular, that bodies are divided up into cells. You'll find that phrase everywhere. No, they're not divided up into cells. The cells divide themselves up to make the body. Now, molecular biologists, I may say Max Perutz is the man who invented molecular biology, and he always came to my lectures, and he was fascinated by my lectures on the intelligence of single cells. I also knew Barbara McClintock, though she never came to one of my talks. But the interest of molecular biology is that it solves so many functional problems. But as I said in my talk, it's as though you're analyzing the ink on the paper and you don't realize it's a Mahler score. You should be listening to the symphony. The organismal biologists are, I think, barking up the wrong tree. I'm a cell biologist. I look at cells, but most people who look at cells look at bulk cells. They'll look at a culture of cells and they'll test them in some way and see how the cells as a whole react. I'm one of the few people, along with Dr. Pickett from Australia, I'm one of the few people who actually look at a cell and see what that single cell does in relationship to its friends. I regard cells as our distinguished chairman, Scott Jordan, said, I regard cells as organisms, creatures with a mind of their own. They're not subsets or bits of anything. They cooperate to produce the phenomenon that we know of life. And of course, when they don't cooperate, that's when you get degenerative diseases. It's the lack of cooperation that causes the trouble. After all, think of a cancer cell. A cancer cell, a normal cell in the body, will divide when it needs to, and it will stop when it should. The cancer cell divides, and even when its colleagues, its environmental associates are signaling to it that it should stop, it doesn't stop. Now, the human cell divides faster than any other cell. A pregnant woman, the way in which a fetus develops in the womb, those cells divide faster than any cancer cell. A baby grows quicker than any tumor ever has. That's an interesting thought in itself. But it's as though the cancer cell isn't listening to what its friends are telling it. So our response to cancer is always the militaristic approach. We blast it with chemicals or with heat, or we'll cut it out with a scalpel. My approach is different. I'd like people to say, well, hang on a second. The cancer cell has gone deaf. It can't hear its cells around it saying to it, stop growing. So why don't we try and restore the hearing of the cancer cell? Or why don't we give it a hearing aid? Why don't we try and investigate a way of of getting the cancer cell to regain its awareness of where it is in the body, rather than simply blasting it with energy. So, I mean, as soon as you begin to look at things from a cell's point of view, life becomes very different. And so, of course, does the future of medicine. I smiled very much at the Uppsala idea that, you know, if we study immune cells, we might be able to harness them to keep us healthy. What on earth do you think they've been doing throughout billions of years of evolution? The hubris, the arrogance of modern scientists, I find really quite extraordinary. And I just wish people would humble themselves and see themselves mirrored through the single cells of which we are composed. That is what we need for the future of science.
Well, I think the argument against the cellular conception is that if you take a cell or the certain number of cells outside of the organism, they will not necessarily produce the organism. So to say that the cells themselves are the cause of the organism sort of misses the role of the organism as a whole, has what effect that has on the cells. And again, this relates back to what I was talking about, the universal in particular. The whole, and in this case, the whole is more than just the cell. It's the combination or unity of all the cells. That there is some influence coming from that universality that is not recognized in the cell biological picture of life. And this
you could well be right.
Yes.
The problem we face, of course, is that few people have ever investigated this. I admired your talk greatly, although you spoke for too long, you bad boy. But I admired your talk greatly because you set the ground perfectly for mine. The way that you spoke of robotics and all of the other things, I mean, really and truly, the delegates at this conference will be quite convinced that the two of us got together and we decided that the two talks would link together as well as they did. I was very impressed by what you said. And yes, the point you raised is right. But these are unanswerable questions that we need to discuss. And until we begin to grasp the realities of the living cell, we can't really start to argue about their significance. But yes, you could well be right.
Thank you.
Mundi Maharaj?
Maharaj was talking about thought and being. Contradiction. And A equals B, and at the same time does not equal B. That's a little difficult for a computer to compute. At what time does it equal B and what time does it not equal B? Cannot be told if A is both equal to or not equal to B. So the computer will crash in that case. Yet thought can conceive how thought and being, although different, they have something in common or similar or identical. So that computation cannot be done. That type of computation cannot be done where there are contradictions. Although thinking can deal with contradictions in a dynamic way, as Hegel has shown in his system, or some say Wittgenstein has also shown in his process philosophy. The point is that a dynamical system of thought can deal with such questions, but a computer which is based on non-contradictory mathematics or Aristotelian thought cannot deal with such contradictions. I don't think they have developed yet a computer that can do dialectical analysis or is based upon a dialectical architecture. This is the dialectic method of Hegel, and it has not yet been computerized. So presently, or if at all, I don't think that computers or artificial intelligence can deal with that problem. Okay, now, Santa Maharaj, what is your question?
I want to ask the question that why actually the idea of imposing or trying to minimize the difference between machine or mechanical system and organism is so central to modern, scientific thought. Why they don't want to emphasize the what you can say clear distinction that person can easily understand also? Why it is not given so much importance, and continuously the idea of non-difference between machine and organism is being propagated.
Yeah. There's a problem of the way they are habituated to think, and the way nature is actually composed or constituted. Nature is purposeful, teleological. It is intrinsic to nature to have a purpose-directed mechanism, or a purpose-directed, what would you call it, foundation. In nature, a thing appears first of all as a seed or an undeveloped beginning, and then gradually develops over time. This does not mean evolution. Development and evolution are two different things, the way I'm trying to use these words. A seed develops into a mature stage by the process of what we call growth. It doesn't evolve from an undeveloped stage to a more developed stage. Evolution is a different process. We mean by evolution, as defined by Darwin, a different process, in which something somehow comes to be through random processes, something else. But development means that a thing comes to be itself fully or matured through a certain process that's intrinsic to the original seed or beginning stage. So this process of development from seed to maturity is not described by science. Science does not know the intricate steps in going from the unmanifest to the manifest stage of a thing. Embryological studies are there, but basically the foundational principle of how a stem cell, say for instance, knows how to develop from its what would you say, homogeneous state, more or less homogeneous state, to a highly differentiated state in the end, such that the original homogeneous state of the zygote can develop in such a way that it produces very different results, including hairs or fingernails, liver, eyes, heart, all these different things that come from the original egg, which are more or less homogeneous. How it differentiates into all these different organs is not known by science. They cannot understand that process. I mean, they can see it before themselves, their microscopes, but they cannot explain how that happens. There is no explanation. So some will give some superficial statements like orientation or whatever they may come up with. However, the process is not fully understood.
I did want to say that the points you're making are most germane and are central to my thinking. You have often said with memorable directness that science cannot make a blade of grass. And of course, you will know that I look at it slightly differently. Science cannot even fully conceive of a single cell within a blade of grass. Within the single cell, you will find plastids, chloroplasts, which are able to fix atmospheric nitrogen. And the process of carbohydrate production by plants through photosynthesis has been known about for a century and a half and has been studied in enormous detail. And yet, although we understand the chemistry, we understand the electron microscopy of the chloroplast, science is entirely unable to replicate something as simple and basic as photosynthesis. There is a chemical called rubipi, which has been used, though it is energetically very inefficient, to mimic some aspects of crude photosynthesis. And I have often said in my lectures that it is a test for human humility. If you see a tiny sprout from a weed sticking through the sidewalk, that little plant is, as you look at it, doing something which science still cannot imitate. To give you another example, the strength of world agriculture depends very much on the leguminosae, the plants which have root nodules containing bacteria like rhizobium, which have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates and thus produce effectively a fertilizer for the soil. In the medieval period in England, it was normal for people to be able to grow fields of legumes in order to be able to understand them and to use their abilities to grow as a way of fertilizing the soil. If you had 1 year where you grew leguminous plants, like, for example, clover, the field they knew would be miraculously fertilized, carried out by these bacteria. Now, we have known about nitrogen fixing bacteria for a century. We have been studying them in intense detail, and yet, to coin your phrase, science cannot imitate the simple process of biological nitrogen fixation. The Fritz-Haber process, which we use industrially, is highly polluting and consumes a vast amount of energy. Yet that little weed growing in the garden is able to do it. And part of the problem for me of the notion of artificial intelligence is that its practitioners are intent on promoting themselves as wondrous wizards, whereas in fact they are ignorant of what intelligence might be. And even the smallest part of a living organism transcends in complexity what we crudely strive to imitate in our computers. There is no such thing as artificial intelligence.